The city is silent now, but it does not feel empty in the ordinary way. It feels interrupted. Streets still run in straight lines through the dust as if feet might return to them at any moment. Brick walls still hold the shapes of rooms where people once slept, cooked, argued, quietly, stored grain, mended tools, washed, waited and watched the river light shift beyond the edge of the settlement. Wells still descend into the earth lined with careful rings of fired brick. Drains still pass beneath the lanes with a precision that seems almost too practical to belong to such deep antiquity. And over everything lies the strange impression of a city that did not collapse into myth all at once, but withdrew from history so completely that even its own name has vanished. Mohenjo-Daro rises from the plains of Sindh like the exposed memory of an older world. The modern name means something like the Mound of the Dead, but that is not what its builders called it. Their words are lost. Their political titles are lost. Their prayers are lost. Their stories are lost. The city itself remains, yet the voice of the city is missing. That is what gives the place its particular gravity. Many ancient ruins feel ruined because time has broken them apart. Mohenjo-Daro feels mysterious because so much of it is still legible in brick and street and drain, while the meaning behind it stays just out of reach. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of this city is not simply the story of stones left behind. It is the story of a civilization large enough to rival Egypt and Mesopotamia, orderly enough to build cities with astonishing discipline, connected enough to trade across long distances, and yet quiet enough in the historical record that scholars still debate how it was governed, what its people believed, and why its great urban centres were eventually abandoned. The phrase often attached to Mohenjo-Daro is tempting an ancient city abandoned overnight. It has the shape of a perfect mystery. One day markets, busy wells, crowded fires burning in courtyards. The next doors left open streets, deserted silence settling over the baked bricks. But archaeology rarely gives the past to us in such clean scenes. The evidence remains incomplete, and the truth is more haunting because it is less simple. There are signs of stress repair, flooding, environmental change, shifting settlement patterns, and gradual transformation. There are also disturbing human remains that once inspired dramatic claims of massacre and sudden destruction. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for what happened here. To stand in the idea of Mohenjo-Daro is to stand inside a contradiction. This was not a crude settlement on the edge of survival. It was one of the most sophisticated cities of the Bronze Age. Its builders understood standardization, sanitation, water management, and urban planning on a scale that still surprises people encountering it for the first time. The bricks were made to consistent proportions. The streets followed a grid. Many houses had bathing areas. Some had private wells. Wastewater moved through covered drains. In a world where kings elsewhere carved their victories into stone and filled tombs with gold, the people of the Indus cities left behind no obvious royal palaces, no giant statues of conquerors, no boastful monuments to war. Their greatness appears in the ordinary systems of urban life. That may be the strangest detail of all. Mohenjo-Daro does not shout. It does not introduce itself with a pyramid or a colossal temple. It whispers through engineering. It says that a large population once lived here with habits of planning, measurement, craft, and maintenance. It says that someone cared about water moving cleanly through a neighborhood. Someone cared about bricks matching in size. Someone cared about streets wide enough to function. Someone cared about rebuilding after floods. What survives in the record suggests a society deeply invested in order, yet the nature of that order remains uncertain. The landscape around the city is part of the mystery. Today the region can feel harsh, dry and open, with heat pressing down on the ruins and salt rising through the ancient brick. But in the 3rd millennium BCE, when Mohenjo-Daro flourished, this was a world shaped by river systems, seasonal waters, fertile fields, and long networks of exchange. The Indus and its related channels gave life but also danger. Rivers move. They flood, split, silt up, abandon old beds, and carve new ones. A civilization built on water gains abundance from it, then discovers that abundance is never fully obedient. At its height, Mohenjo-Daro belonged to a much larger cultural world spread across what is now Pakistan and northwest India, with connections reaching toward Afghanistan, Iran, the Arabian Sea, and Mesopotamia. This was not a lonely city. It was part of an immense urban tradition, with Harappa, Dholavira, Ganweriwala, Rakigahi, and many smaller settlements forming a landscape of shared waits, seals, crafts, symbols, and building habits. Yet unlike Egypt, where names of pharaohs march through history, or Mesopotamia, where kings, wars, and laws survive on tablets, the Indus world remains unusually anonymous. Its script has not been deciphered. Its leaders, if it had leaders in the familiar sense, do not step forward. Its collapse leaves no final chronicle. So the abandoned city becomes a kind of test. It asks how much can be known from drains, bricks, bones, beads, and broken seals. It asks whether collapse is always an event, or sometimes a long unravelling that later generations compress into a single, dramatic disappearance. It asks whether a civilization can end without vanishing, whether people can leave a city behind while carrying its habits into other places, other villages, other forms of life. The popular imagination wants the empty street, the sudden catastrophe, the last day. Archaeology offers something slower, stranger, and perhaps more human. Mohenjo-Daro was not abandoned because history ran out of interest in it. It was abandoned because something changed in the relationship between people, waterland trade, and power. Perhaps the river betrayed the city. Perhaps the rains weakened. Perhaps floods returned too often or not often enough. Perhaps long-distance exchange faltered. Perhaps disease moved through dense neighbourhoods. Perhaps authority fragmented. Perhaps families made practical decisions over generations, moving towards smaller settlements, safer ground, more reliable fields. Scholars still debate the balance of these forces, and the evidence refuses to become a single neat answer. What remains is the scene that begins the story: streets without footsteps, wells without voices, bathing platforms without water walls, without names. The city was not truly frozen in one night, but it does preserve the deeper shock of disappearance. A place built with such care should have explained itself. Instead, it leaves behind a map of daily life and withholds the ending. The people who made Mohenjo-Daro were not primitive shadows. They were urban, skilled, adaptive, and deeply connected to their environment. And yet, after centuries of life, the city lost its central place in the world. The first mystery, then, is not merely why Mohenjo-Daro was abandoned. It is how a civilization so vast, so organized, and so materially present could become so historically quiet. The answer begins not with death, but with water, mud, brick, and the slow rise of a river-born world. Long before Mohenjo-Daro becomes a mound of baked brick under the synth sun, it begins as an answer to water. Not a simple answer, because rivers in this part of the world are never simple. They arrive with silt and fertility, with seasonal promise, with flood and ruin, with channels that can nourish a field for generations, and then slide away from it without apology. The Indus landscape is alive in a geological sense. It shifts, braids, deposits, erodes, and remembers older courses beneath newer plains. For the people who eventually build one of the great urban civilizations of the Bronze Age, this restless water is both foundation and threat. The rise of the Indus world does not begin with the sudden city. It begins with villages, fields, Animals craft traditions and the patient accumulation of practical knowledge. Communities learn where crops can grow when floods come, how to store grain, how to manage herds, how to shape clay, how to fire brick, how to move goods across difficult distances, and how to survive in a land where abundance often depends on timing. Wheat and barley grow in the cooler season. Pulses, sesame, dates, and other crops add variety. Cattle, sheep, goats, and water buffalo become part of the human landscape. The evidence remains incomplete in many places, but what survives suggests not a single origin point, but a long regional development, a gradual tightening of shared habits across a broad and varied terrain. By the time cities like Mohenjo-Daro flourish, the Indus civilization stretches across an astonishing area. It is not confined to one narrow river valley. It reaches from the plains of Punjab and Sindh toward Baluchistan, Gujarat, Haryana, Rajasthan, and beyond, touching mountains, deserts, coasts, river plains, and semi-arid zones. This diversity matters because the civilization is not merely an agricultural system, it is a network. Raw materials move from place to place. Shell comes from coastal zones. Lapis and other stones connect the world of the plains to highland and distant exchange routes. Carnelian is shaped into beads of remarkable precision. Copper and bronze tools circulate. Standardized weights suggest a shared language of measurement, even when the spoken languages themselves have vanished from hearing. Mohenjo-Daro rises within this wider pattern as a city of scale and confidence. It is not an accidental sprawl. It belongs to a world that already understands planning before its largest settlements reach maturity. There are earlier phases beneath and around the urban peak, and there are many smaller sites that show how deeply the larger cities depend on rural production, craft specialization and exchange. A city cannot live on bricks alone. It needs grain from fields, fuel for fires, timber or brush for construction, and industry animals for labour and food, potters, bead makers, metal workers, merchants, administrators, builders, and people whose names are not preserved, but whose daily work holds the system together. The river gives the city its reason for existing. Fertile alluvium supports farming. River routes ease movement. Floods renew fields. Water allows dense settlement where dense settlement would otherwise be impossible. But the Indus world does not simply wait for nature to be kind. Its cities show a practical obsession with managing the material conditions of life. Water is drawn, stored, channeled, drained, and controlled at household and civic levels. This does not mean the civilization commands the river in the modern sense. No Bronze Age society can fully command such forces, but it adapts to them with intelligence. It builds high platforms. It rebuilds over earlier layers. It accepts that cities in floodplains must rise, repair, and rise again. What is especially striking is the consistency across distant places. Bricks often follow similar proportions. Weights appear in standardized systems. Seals bear recurring animals and signs. Pottery styles, craft methods, and urban layouts suggest communication across immense distances. Scholars still debate how this coordination was achieved. Was there centralized authority, a network of elites, powerful merchant groups, ritual specialists, local councils, or some structure that does not fit easily into later political categories? The Indus world leaves too little direct testimony to answer with confidence. But the coordination itself is real. A person moving between major Indus settlements would likely recognize measures, symbols, objects, and practices that belong to a shared cultural sphere. Yet this civilization is not a mirror of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Its difference is essential. In Egypt, the Nile's regular flood becomes tied to kingship, divine order, and monumental stone architecture. In Mesopotamia, city-states compete record transactions, name rulers, wage wars, and leave vast archives of clay tablets. The Indus cities, by contrast, present a quieter archaeological face. Their writing appears mostly in short inscriptions on seals and objects. Their monuments are not obviously royal or military. Their public buildings remain debated. Even their religion must be inferred cautiously from figurines, symbols, bathing structures, animals, and later echoes that may or may not preserve ancient continuities. No single explanation fully accounts for this silence. The rise of Mohenjo-Daro therefore feels both familiar and alien. Familiar because cities everywhere require food, labour-water planning and exchange. Alien because the usual signs by which ancient states announce themselves are muted here. There are no great carved lists of conquered peoples. No king stands oversized above prisoners. No royal tomb declares that one man's death required a mountain of treasure. Instead, the city's authority seems embedded in systems. The brick itself becomes a clue. The drain becomes a clue. The well becomes a clue. The weight stone becomes a clue. Power may have existed not as a face on a monument, but as a discipline of standards. That discipline is visible in the city's material life. Fired brick requires fuel and planning. Standardized brick requires agreement. Urban drainage requires maintenance. Large neighborhoods require coordination beyond a single household. Long-distance trade requires trust or enforcement, and usually both. The surprising detail is not only that these systems existed, but that they endured for centuries across such a large region, with relatively little visible glorification of rulers. What survives in the record suggests an urban tradition deeply confident in regularity. It built not to astonish the gods from afar, but to make daily life function at close range. This is why the later abandonment feels so unsettling. Mohenjo-Daro is not a fragile camp that briefly appears and disappears. It is part of a mature civilization with deep roots and wide connections. Its people inherit generations of knowledge about land and water. They live in a world that has already solved many difficult problems of settlement. When such a city begins to fail, the cause is unlikely to be one simple blow. Something must disturb the network itself, the river, the climate, the fields, the trade routes, the social order, or some combination that gradually makes old solutions less effective. For now, though, the city is still rising. Brick by brick, drain by drain, field by field, it takes shape beside the life-giving uncertainty of water. Its streets prepare to hold thousands of lives. Its wells deepen. Its workshops brighten with fire. Its seals pass from hand to hand. Its people create one of the most remarkable urban worlds of antiquity, and they do so without leaving us the names by which they understood themselves. The planned city reveals itself most clearly not from a distance, but from the level of the street. From above, Mohenjo-Daro can look like a map of lines and blocks, a geometry of baked brick set against a plain that has changed many times since the city was alive. But the closer one comes to the lanes, the more the place begins to feel intimate. The city is not only an archaeological pattern, it is an arrangement of movement. A person turns a corner, passes a doorway, steps near a covered drain, hears water drawn from a well, smells cooking fires somewhere behind a wall, and moves through a world where public order and private life are tightly fitted together. The streets are among the first clues that Mohenjo-Daro belongs to a highly organized urban tradition. Many run roughly north-south and east-west, forming blocks that suggest planning rather than accidental growth. Not every lane is perfectly straight, and the city is not the rigid machine that older descriptions sometimes imagined, but the overall impression remains one of deliberate structure. Main streets are wider, smaller lanes feed into them, and houses generally open onto side streets rather than directly onto the busiest routes. This small detail matters. It hints at a society attentive to privacy, traffic, dust noise, and the ordinary practicalities of living close together. The bricks themselves carry another kind of order. Fired bricks at Mohenjo-Daro often follow standardized proportions, commonly described as a ratio of thickness, width, and length that appears across many Indus sites. A brick is a humble object easy to overlook beside temples and statues, yet here it becomes one of the civilization's signatures. Standard brick sizes make construction more predictable. They make repairs easier. They suggest trained labor, shared expectations, and repeated habits passed from builders to builders. The evidence remains incomplete about who enforced these standards, but the standards are there stacked into walls, platforms, drains, wells, bathing floors, and stairways. Water is everywhere in the design. That is one of the great astonishments of the city. Many ancient settlements have wells, but Mohenjo-Daro has them in remarkable abundance. Some serve individual houses or clusters of houses, others likely serve broader neighborhoods. Their brick-lined shafts descend into the ground with a practical, elegant, circular forms made from wedge-shaped bricks or carefully arranged courses. To draw water in such a city is not an occasional act at the edge of settlement. It is part of the domestic rhythm. Water enters courtyards, bathing rooms, kitchens, and lanes. It moves from the unseen underground into daily human use, then away again through channels that show an equally strong concern with removal. The drainage system gives Mohenjo-Daro its most famous aura of modernity, though that word can mislead. It was not modern, it was Bronze Age, and it should be understood on its own terms. Yet the city's covered drains, soak jars, bathing platforms, and wastewater channels show a level of civic attention that remains striking. In many houses, water from bathing areas seems to have been directed into street drains through small outlets. Large drains were often covered with removable brick or stone slabs, allowing cleaning and maintenance. This is not glamorous architecture. It is the architecture of inconvenience solved before it becomes disaster. Someone had to build it. Someone had to clear it. Someone had to accept that city life depends on what happens beneath the feet. One of the most famous structures at Mohenjo-Daro is the so-called Great Bath. The name is modern, but the structure deserves its reputation. It is a large, carefully built tank set within a complex on the elevated mound often called the Citadel. Its floor and walls were made watertight with fired brick and bitumen, and steps descend into the basin from opposite ends. Around it are rooms and corridors whose exact functions remain debated. Scholars still debate whether the bath served ritual purification, communal ceremony, elite gathering, or some combination of uses that cannot be recovered with certainty. What survives in the record suggests that water was not merely practical here. It may also have carried social or symbolic weight. The elevated mound itself has inspired many interpretations. It is often called a citadel, though that term can create the wrong image. It was not necessarily a fortress in the military sense, and the evidence for kings, garrisons, or defensive command remains uncertain. The mound may represent a raised platform built partly in response to flooding, partly to support important public structures, and partly to create separation between certain civic or ceremonial spaces and lower residential areas. Here again, Mohenjo-Daro refuses easy categories. Its architecture implies hierarchy of space, but not in the obvious language of royal domination. It organizes difference without explaining it. The lower town spreads outward with dense residential blocks. Houses vary in size from modest dwellings to larger compounds with multiple rooms and courtyards. Many are inward-facing, built around open spaces that admit light and air, while keeping family life shielded from the street. Doorways are sometimes positioned to reduce direct views into private interiors. Staircases suggest upper stories. Some houses contain storage spaces, bathing floors, wells and latrine-like installations. The lesser-known surprise is how domestic the city's sophistication feels. Its most impressive achievements are not always grand public monuments, but the careful multiplication of useful details across ordinary homes. This multiplication implies labour on a huge scale. Brickmakers dig clay-shape bricks, dry them, fire them and transport them. Builders align walls, repair drains, raise platforms and modify older structures. Water carriers, potters, sweepers, cooks, bead makers, traders, farmers and animals all move through the city systems. Urban order is never just design. It is maintenance repeated until it becomes invisible. The drains that impress modern visitors would have failed without cleaning. Wells would have needed repair. Streets would have needed clearing after floods or seasonal dust. What looks like stillness in the ruins was once a constant negotiation with decay. Flooding leaves its traces. Mohenjo-daro was built and rebuilt in layers, and some levels show evidence of water damage and repair. The city's relationship with the Indus was never passive. To live near such a river is to live with both nourishment and intrusion. Walls crack, silt accumulates, floors rise, drains clog, and new construction covers old damage. The planned city is therefore not a perfect blueprint imposed once on empty land. It is an evolving organism repaired and adapted through generations. No single explanation fully accounts for its form because its form is partly a history of response. That is what makes the city's later abandonment more difficult to imagine as a sudden act. A place like this represents deep investment. It is expensive in labour, memory and habit. Families know their wells. Craftspeople know their workshops. Children know the routes between houses, lanes and open spaces. Builders know which walls rest on older walls. A city of baked brick is not easily walked away from, unless the reasons become stronger than attachment. Yet the same systems that make Mohenjo-daro impressive may also reveal its vulnerability. Dense urban life needs reliable water, manageable waste, stable food supply, functioning exchange and enough shared authority to maintain the hidden machinery. The planned stone maze therefore gives the mystery its shape. Mohenjo-daro was not simply occupied, it was managed. It was not merely inhabited, it was coordinated. Its streets and drains show a civilization capable of creating order in a difficult environment. But order is not permanence. Beneath the lines of the streets lies the quiet warning that every city is a bargain with the forces around it, and every bargain has terms that can change. Inside the brick walls of Mohenjo-daro, the mystery becomes smaller and more human. It is easy to look at the city from above and see only planning, drainage, standardization, and the impressive discipline of an urban system. But no one lives in a system in the abstract. People live through mornings, meals, chores, repairs, trades, worries, habits, and small pleasures that rarely enter written history, even when writing can be read. Here, where the script remains silent, the ordinary objects become especially important. A broken toy, a bead, a cooking pot, a shell, bangle, a seal, a grinding stone, a figurine, a worn threshold, a repaired wall. These are the surviving fragments of lives that once filled the city with motion. The people of Mohenjo-daro wake in houses built around courtyards and rooms shaped by heat, privacy and work. Some households are modest, others more spacious, but many share a concern for inward life. The street may belong to movement, trade and neighbours, while the courtyard belongs to family tasks and domestic rhythm. Food is prepared with grains such as wheat and barley with pulses, and perhaps vegetables, fruits, milk products and meat depending on household means, season and availability. Fish from rivers, cattle, sheep, goats and water buffalo all belong somewhere in the wider food world of the Indus. The evidence remains incomplete, but bones, seeds, tools, and residues suggest a varied diet shaped by farming, herding, river resources, and exchange. Craft is one of the clearest ways to enter the city's life. Mohenjo-daro was not only a place where goods arrived, it was a place where things were made finished, sorted, stored, and used. Bead making was especially refined in the Indus world. Carnelian, a reddish stone that can glow like held fire when polished, was cut, drilled, heated, and shaped into beads that travelled far beyond local neighbourhoods. Some long carnelian beads required extraordinary patience and technical skill, including drilling with specialised tools through hard stone. This is one of those details that seems small until its implications widen. A bead is portable, beautiful and personal, but it also carries evidence of workshops, trade routes, raw material supply, skilled labour and shared taste. Shell objects tell another story of distance. Mohenjo-daro lies inland, yet shell bangles and ornaments connect it to coastal zones along the Arabian Sea. Someone gathers shells, someone cuts and shapes them, someone transports them across landscapes, someone wears them in the city. Copper and bronze tools similarly point beyond the immediate plain toward mining regions and networks of exchange. Steatite seals, often carved with animals and short inscriptions, suggest control over goods, identity, ownership, ritual meaning, or administrative practice, though scholars still debate their exact use. The famous unicorn-like motif appears again and again, not a real unicorn in the later fantasy sense, but a stylized creature that becomes one of the civilization's most recognizable signs. The seals are quiet but powerful. They fit in the hand, yet they open onto a world of symbols. Many show animals, bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, buffalo goats, composite forms, and that strange one-horned figure. Above them often appear short rows of signs from the undeciphered Indus script. Some seals were likely pressed into clay or used in marking goods, but not all uses are certain. Their backs sometimes have bosses with holes suggesting they could be worn or suspended. They are administrative objects perhaps, but also identity objects, status objects, maybe ritual objects. No single explanation fully accounts for their presence across so many sites. Children leave traces too, though the traces are easy to miss. Terracotta toys, small carts, animal figurines and objects with movable parts suggest play, imitation and learning. A child in Mohenjo-daro might push a little cart that echoes real carts, moving goods through lanes or across fields. A figurine of an animal might be toy-teaching object, household symbol, or something less easily categorized. The surprising detail is not that ancient children played, but that their play survives at all in a city otherwise known through systems and mysteries. It reminds us that the abandoned city was not abandoned by abstractions. It was left by families. Adornment appears everywhere in the archaeological imagination of the city. Beads, bangles, pendants, hair ornaments, and carefully made small objects suggest a society attentive to appearance and identity. Materials vary. Some ornaments are humble, others require distant connections and specialized labor. Differences in access likely existed, though Mohenjo-daro does not display wealth inequality in the spectacular form of royal tombs or treasure burials. This absence can be misleading if treated too simply. Inequality may have existed in perishable goods, social roles, access to space control of trade or ritual authority. What survives in the record suggests difference, but not the kind of loudly staged hierarchy familiar from some other Bronze Age societies. Workshops would have added sound and smell to the city. Potters shape and fire vessels. Metalworkers heat hammer cast and sharpen tools. Beadmakers grind stone and drill with concentration. Brickmakers feed kilns that consume fuel in great quantities. Weavers may have worked with cotton, one of the important and often noted contributions of the Indus region to early textile history, though textiles rarely survive in the climate. The people of Mohenjo-Daro almost certainly lived among fabrics baskets, wooden objects, ropes, mats, and other perishable things that have mostly disappeared. Archaeology preserves the durable skeleton of daily life, not its full body. There is also the matter of cleanliness, or at least water-centered routine. Many houses include bathing areas, and the city's drainage system suggests that washing was built into ordinary domestic space. It is risky to project later religious practices backward too confidently, but water clearly matters here beyond mere survival. People wash bodies, vessels, floors, and perhaps participate in forms of purification or social practice that cannot be reconstructed fully. The Great Bath has already appeared as a public clue, but the smaller bathing platforms are just as revealing. They show that water management is woven into the household, repeated not as spectacle, but as habit. The animals of the city form another layer. Humped cattle are central to the Indus world, appearing in art and likely in agriculture, transport and status. Dogs may move along the lanes. Birds gather near refuse. Water buffalo belong to wet landscapes. Elephants and rhinoceroses appear in imagery, whether as observed animals, symbols, or markers of a wider ecological world richer than the modern imagination may expect. The Indus environment of the 3rd millennium BCE included wetlands, riverine habitats, grasslands, cultivated fields, and zones that supported a range of wildlife. The city was urban, but it was not sealed away from animals, mud insects, seasonal smells, and the pressure of the living landscape. The people themselves remain difficult to name in cultural or linguistic terms. Their bones can tell parts of the story, health, diet, ancestry, disease, injury, and movement. Their objects tell other parts. Their houses suggest family organization, but do not fully reveal it. Their graves, often relatively modest compared with those of Egypt or Mesopotamia, complicate assumptions about status and belief. Scholars still debate whether the Indus world had strong central rulers, merchant elites, priestly authorities, clan-based organization, or changing local systems over time. The evidence does not permit a single confident portrait, yet the human presence is undeniable. Every brick was touched, every drain was cleaned by someone or failed because someone did not clean it. Every bead was made with eyes and fingers, every pot broke in use in storage, in accident, or in abandonment. A city's mystery can become too grand if one thinks only of collapse. Mohenjo-Daro asks first to be understood as a place that worked. For centuries, people adapted to heat, flood, crowding, tradecraft, family life, and civic expectation. They made an urban world not out of legend but out of repeated acts. That's why the silence later feels so deep. The more ordinary life becomes visible, the harder it is to imagine the city as merely deserted ruins. It was once crowded with routines that seemed durable, because all routines do. The grinding of grain, the drawing of water, the polishing of beads, the sealing of goods, the washing of floors, the repairing of walls. These acts make civilization feel permanent from the inside. And then across time they stop. The strange thing about Mohenjo-Daro is not that it had power, but that power refuses to show its face. In many ancient cities, authority announces itself with almost theatrical certainty. A king's name is carved into stone. A palace rises above surrounding houses. A tomb swallows wealth that could have fed villages. A victory scene displays enemies crushed beneath a ruler's feet in case anyone has failed to understand the arrangement. Mohenjo-Daro does not speak this way. It has scale, order, labor planning, craft, trade, and public architecture, yet it lacks the obvious monuments of domination that make other Bronze Age societies easier or at least more tempting to interpret. This absence has shaped the city's mystery from the beginning. Early excavators expected to find the familiar signs of ancient hierarchy. They looked for palaces, temples, fortifications, royal tombs, and inscriptions naming rulers. Some large buildings were given practical modern labels: Granary College, Assembly Hall, Citadel. But labels can harden faster than evidence. The so-called citadel may not have been a citadel in the military sense. The so-called granary remains debated. The so-called priest-king, a small carved figure with a patterned robe and composed face, may not have been a priest, a king, or even a ruler at all. It is one of the most famous objects from the Indus world yet. Its title reveals more about modern expectations than ancient certainty. What survives in the record suggests coordination on a major scale that cannot be dismissed. Someone or some institution organizes brick production, street layouts, drainage wells, public structures, craft standards, weights, seals, and the rhythms of exchange. Cities do not maintain themselves through good intentions alone. There must be rules, habits, obligations, punishments, incentives, or forms of authority strong enough to keep urban systems functioning. But whether that authority is royal, priestly, mercantile, communal, bureaucratic, or something less familiar, remains one of the central debates of Indus archaeology. The absence of obvious palaces is particularly striking. In Mesopotamian cities, palace complexes often dominate the built environment and textual record. They gather goods, command labor, sponsor craft production, and connect rulers to gods. In Egypt, kingship becomes monumentalized on a scale almost impossible to ignore. Mohenjo-Daro's architecture does not present such a clear royal core. There are large buildings and elevated areas, but none can be confidently identified as a king's residence. The largest houses are bigger than ordinary dwellings, yet they do not separate themselves with the overwhelming theatrical grandeur associated with later or neighboring states. This does not prove equality. It proves only that inequality of present expressed itself differently. That distinction matters. It is tempting to imagine the Indus civilization as peaceful, egalitarian, and unusually rational, a kind of Bronze Age urban society without kings or war. There may be some truth in the impression of less visible militarism. Weapons are not absent, but they are not central in the way they are in many other ancient visual cultures. Defensive architecture is not as prominent or clear as in some neighboring regions. There are no carved battle scenes, yet absence is not the same as proof. Perishable weapons may have vanished. Conflict may have taken forms not easily preserved. Authority may have been real without leaving boastful images. Scholars still debate how far the archaeological quietness reflects the society itself, and how far it reflects the kinds of evidence that survived. The seal system offers one window into power, though it is a narrow one. Seals bearing animals and signs appear across the Indus world, and their standardization suggests controlled communication ownership, trade or administrative marking. A seal can be a tool of commerce, a badge of identity, a symbol of office, or an object with ritual meaning. Its small size should not fool us. In societies without paper documents, a seal can carry authority. It can close a container mark, a shipment, identify a person or signal trust within a network. But because the script remains unread, the seal's full message is locked. It is like finding thousands of signatures without knowing the names. Weights speak more clearly. The Indus weight system is remarkably standardized, often based on carefully shaped stone weights in binary and decimal progressions. Such weights imply measurement, exchange, accountability, and shared expectations. They suggest that goods move through systems where quantity mattered, and where people agreed or were made to agree on what a measure meant. This is power in a quieter form. It does not need a statue. It exists when a trader in one settlement and a craft producer in another recognize the same standard. It exists when officials, merchants, or household managers can compare, count, and verify. Urban sanitation is also a form of authority. Drains require collective compliance. A household cannot maintain a citywide drainage network alone. Streets must remain passable. Waste must be directed. Wells must not be casually destroyed. Construction must fit the larger plan. The most surprising thing about Mohenjo-Daro's power may be that it appears as maintenance. Modern eyes often look for drama, but the city's authority may have lived in regulation, custom, and repeated civic labour. Someone decided where drains went. Someone enforced or encouraged the placement of walls. Someone organised rebuilding after floods. Someone made sure that public systems did not simply dissolve into private convenience. This makes Mohenjo-Daro feel unusually contemporary in one sense. Cities today also depend less on visible rulers than on infrastructure schedules, codes, pipes, standard sanitation, and trust. A modern city can seem leaderless at street level while being deeply governed by invisible systems. Mohenjo-Daro may have had its own version of this hidden order. Not modern bureaucracy, of course, but an ancient structure of civic coordination whose outward signs do not match the royal patterns known elsewhere. Religion may have played a role, but here again, certainty dissolves quickly. Figurines, animal symbols, possible ritual objects, and the Great Bath have inspired many interpretations. Some scholars have suggested purification rituals, fertility cults, ancestor practices, proto-Shiva imagery, goddess worship, sacred animals, or water-centered ceremonies. Some of these ideas remain possible. Others have been stretched too far by later comparisons. The evidence remains incomplete, and it is dangerous to turn resemblance into proof. What can be said more carefully is that symbolic life existed. Animals mattered in imagery. Water may have held special significance, and some spaces were likely more than purely domestic. The lack of royal tombs deepens the puzzle. Burial practices in the Indus world vary, but they do not produce the extravagant mortuary displays that define elite power elsewhere. No pharaoh-like tomb waits beneath Mohenjo-Daro. No treasure chamber names a dynasty. This could mean that elites were buried in ways not yet found, that status was expressed through perishable materials, that cremation or other practices removed evidence, or that social ranking was less violently materialized in death. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. It remains one of the reasons the Indus civilization feels both advanced and elusive. The city without kings then is not necessarily a city without hierarchy. It is a city whose hierarchy is archaeologically quiet. Its authority may have been distributed among groups rather than concentrated in one divine monarch. It may have rested in merchant networks, ritual specialists, neighborhood leaders, land-holding families, or administrative officials whose names were written on seals we cannot read. It may have changed over time as the city grew flooded, rebuilt, and faced pressure. Mohenjo-Daro does not allow us to choose too confidently, and this uncertainty matters for the abandonment. If a city is held together by a visible king, collapse can sometimes be framed as the fall of a dynasty. If a city is held together by a temple, the failure of cult and economy may leave signs in records. But if Mohenjo-Daro is held together by dispersed systems of standards, water-controlled tradecraft, and civic habit, then its unravelling may be harder to see. There may be no final throne room burned, no last king slain, no dramatic decree. The city may weaken when maintenance becomes harder, when standards loosen, when exchange declines, when neighbourhoods adapt separately, when the shared order that once seemed natural becomes too costly to sustain. The most powerful figure in Mohenjo-Daro may therefore be missing, not because archaeology has failed to find him, but because the city was never built around him in the way we expect. Its ruler may have been a system, its monument may have been the street, its command may have been the measure, the drain, the brick, the seal, the habit of doing things in a shared way. And when that habit finally faltered, the city did not need to be conquered in a single night to become vulnerable. It only needed enough people over enough time to stop believing that this particular arrangement could still hold. The deepest silence in Mohenjo-Daro is not the silence of its empty streets. Streets are always silent after enough centuries. Walls lose voices, wells lose hands, courtyards lose footsteps. But the script is different. The script is a silence that looks as if it should speak. It appears on seals, tablets, pottery tools, ornaments, and small objects handled by real people in the middle of real lives. It arranges itself in careful signs, sometimes beside animals, sometimes alone, often brief, confident, and frustratingly complete-looking. It seems to know exactly what it means. Only we do not. The Indus script is one of the great unresolved problems of ancient history. It is not rare enough to be dismissed as accidental decoration, and not long enough in surviving examples to be easily deciphered. Most inscriptions are short, often only a handful of signs. There is no known bilingual text like the Rosetta Stone. There is no long royal inscription listing victories, laws, genealogies, or offerings. There are no clay tablet archives like those of Mesopotamia, where repeated administrative formulas allow language to reveal itself through quantity. The Indus signs survive mostly as compact messages, and compact messages are the hardest to unlock when the language beneath them is unknown. This matters because almost every major question about Mohenjo-Daro passes through that locked door. Who governed the city? What did the seals say? Were they names, titles, offices, clans, commodities, rituals, quantities, or something more complex? Did the people call their city by a name tied to the river, a deity, a lineage, a place marker, or something entirely different? Did they record myths, contracts, laws, hymns, taxes, or trade agreements on materials that have not survived? Scholars still debate not only how to read the script, but even what kind of writing system it was. Some argue it encoded language in a true script. Others have proposed that it may have been a system of symbols used for identity ritual or administration without representing full speech in the way later writing does. The stronger mainstream tendency treats it as meaningful and structured, but the evidence remains incomplete. The signs themselves have an eerie beauty. There are shapes that look like fish jars, tridents, combs, grids, leaves, circles, strokes, and human-like or animal-like forms, though these visual comparisons may mislead. A sign that looks like a fish to modern eyes may not mean fish. A jar shape may not mean jar. Writing systems often begin in images and then drift into sound convention and abstraction. Without the key, even the most obvious-looking sign may be a trap. The people of Mohenjo-Daro would have recognized these marks instantly, but to us they hover between picture and language. The brevity of the inscriptions has encouraged many theories. Some researchers have searched for statistical patterns, sign order, repetition, and positional rules. Certain signs appear more often at the beginning or end of inscriptions. Some combinations recur. This suggests structure, not random ornament. The script generally seems to run from right to left, based partly on sign compression and other clues, though direction may not be absolutely uniform in every case. The number of known signs depends on how variants are counted, but it's large enough to suggest a complex system and small enough that many scholars suspect logosyllabic or logophonetic possibilities rather than a simple alphabet. Yet no proposal has achieved broad consensus. Language is the harder problem beneath the script. The Indus people may have spoken an early Dravidian language, or something related to lost language families, or several languages across the wide civilization. Indo-Aryan languages are generally associated with later developments in South Asia, though the timing and complexity of language change remain debated. Some hypotheses connect the script to Dravidian roots, others look elsewhere. But decipherment cannot rest on desire. A proposed reading must explain many inscriptions, sign patterns, archaeological contexts, and linguistic probabilities without forcing the evidence. So far, none has convinced the field as a whole. This leaves Mohenjo-Daro in an unusual historical position. It is deeply archaeological but barely textual. Egypt and Mesopotamia speak in names even when those names are propagandistic. The Indus world speaks in objects whose words remain sealed. The result is not total ignorance, but a particular kind of knowledge. We know the city through material behavior rather than narrative self-description. We can see how streets were laid, how drains were built, how weights were standardized, how beads were drilled, how goods traveled, how houses were arranged. We can infer systems, but we cannot read intentions directly. A lesser-known detail makes this silence even more intriguing. Indus marks are not found only on formal seals. They appear scratched or painted on pottery, impressed on clay inscribed on small tablets, and placed on objects that may have moved through varied contexts. This suggests that signs circulated beyond a single narrow elite archive. They were part of a broader visual environment. People saw them, used them, trusted them, perhaps feared or respected them. A seal stamped into clay may have closed a package. A mark on a pot may have identified content's owner, maker, destination, or ritual value. A tiny tablet may have carried information now completely inaccessible. The city was not illiterate in the broad sense of being without signs. It was full of signs. It is we who are illiterate before it. The failure to decipher the script has also distorted the mystery of abandonment. Without readable records, there is no final complaint about failed rains, no list of grain shortages, no account of disease, no warning that a river has shifted, no lament for a city in decline. If administrators struggle to maintain food supply, their records are lost or unread. If merchants notice trade weakening, their accounts do not speak to us. If ritual specialists interpreted flood or drought as divine displeasure, their prayers have not survived in a readable form. What survives in the record suggests change, but it does not preserve the voices of those living through it. This absence invites imagination, and imagination must be handled carefully. Popular versions of Mohenjo-Daro often fill the script's silence with dramatic stories: invasion, catastrophe, mysterious weapons, lost wisdom, even unsupported claims far outside mainstream archaeology. The city's unread signs become a screen onto which modern people project whatever they want the ancient world to be. But the more responsible path is slower. The script is mysterious not because it proves impossible fantasies, but because it denies easy certainty about a real and complex civilization. There is also a subtle emotional effect in the unread writing. A broken wall can seem naturally mute. A line of signs feels almost personal. It is as though someone left a note on a table in a house, whose occupants departed long ago, and the note remains perfectly visible but unreadable. It may say something ordinary. It may say a name. It may identify a shipment of grain. It may mark an official. It may invoke protection. It may be far less poetic than the ruins around it. Yet even the ordinary would be extraordinary if it could be read. The undeciphered script keeps Mohenjo-Daro from becoming too familiar. Every time the city seems clear, the signs interrupt. A seal with a one-horned animal and a short inscription might belong to a merchant, a clan, a deity, a workshop, a tax authority, or a ritual role. The Great Bath might connect to beliefs named in texts we cannot read. A large building might be administrative, ceremonial, economic, or residential, in ways its inscriptions could clarify, if only they yielded. The city's order is visible, but its categories remain hidden, and so the script becomes a central character in the story of abandonment, not because it records the abandonment in a language we have lost, though perhaps somewhere it once did, but because its silence shapes every answer we attempt. Mohenjo-Daro did not vanish without leaving marks. It left thousands. The tragedy, or perhaps the challenge, is that the marks have outlived their readers. Until they speak, the city remains suspended between knowledge and uncertainty, built of brick drained by careful channels filled with objects and sealed at its deepest level by signs that still refuse to open. The first cracks in Mohenjo-Daro's world do not need to look dramatic. They do not need to arrive as a burning skyline or a final scream in the streets. In a city built on systems, danger can begin as maintenance. A drain silts up more often than it once did. A wall repaired after one flood needs repair again after the next. A street level rises because new floors are laid over old damage. A house is rebuilt in a way that suggests less care, less space, or less access to the earlier standards. The city continues, but the effort required to keep it functioning grows heavier. Collapse in such a place may first appear as inconvenience. Mohenjo-Daro lives with flooding throughout its history. That fact is not incidental. It is part of the city's biography. The Indus River and its changing channels bring fertility transport and connection, but they also bring silt erosion, waterlogging, and destruction. Archaeological layers at the site show episodes of rebuilding and damage, and earlier excavators recognized flood deposits that seem to interrupt phases of occupation. Interpreting these layers is not always straightforward because ancient cities accumulate messily, and later disturbance can confuse the record. Still, what survives suggests that the people of Mohenjo-Daro repeatedly faced water, not as an abstraction, but as a force entering the built environment. A flood in such a city is more than a natural event. It is a civic test. Water fills low spaces. It pushes mud into lanes. It contaminates wells. It weakens walls. It blocks drains meant to carry smaller flows, not whole seasons of river violence. It damages stored grain and forces families to abandon rooms until they can be cleaned and repaired. On the elevated mound, important buildings may survive better, but the lower neighborhoods take the punishment directly. The city is designed with water in mind, but design does not remove risk. It only gives people a fighting chance. Over generations, the city rises in layers because people respond. They repair floors. They raise platforms. They rebuild walls over earlier walls. This is resilience, but resilience has a cost. Each repair consumes labor and materials. Each rebuilding assumes that staying is still worth it. For a long time it must have been. Mohenjo-Daro's persistence shows that its people were not helpless before environmental stress. They adapted again and again. But adaptation can become exhaustion when conditions change faster or when several pressures accumulate at once. No single explanation fully accounts for the later abandonment, yet flood stress remains one important strand in the larger pattern. There are signs, especially in later levels, that urban order may have begun to loosen. Some structures appear more cramped or irregular than the earlier ideal of spacious planning suggests. Older public spaces may have been encroached upon. Brick reuse becomes important in some areas as people take material from existing structures rather than producing everything fresh. These signs should not be overread as proof of immediate collapse. Cities constantly modify themselves. Poorer neighborhoods exist in thriving cities. Reuse is practical, not necessarily desperate. But when such details appear alongside broader environmental and settlement changes, they begin to feel like part of a larger weakening. One lesser-known issue is the problem of salt. Mohenjo-Daro's bricks have suffered heavily from salt crystallization in modern times, but salinity and waterlogging may also have affected ancient agricultural lands in parts of the Indus region. Irrigated or floodplain agriculture can bring salts toward the surface, especially where drainage is poor and evaporation is intense. The exact scale of ancient salinity problems around Mohenjo-Daro remains debated, and it would be too simple to blame the city's decline on salt alone. But the possibility reminds us that environmental stress often works quietly. Fields do not need to become desert overnight. Yields can diminish, gradually making life harder one season at a time. The river itself may have changed in ways that altered the city's fortunes. Rivers in alluvial plains are restless. They shift courses, abandon channels, create new levees, and transform the relationship between settlement and water. A city that flourishes beside an active river route can find itself too close to destructive flooding in one period and too far from reliable flow in another. The Indus system is especially dynamic, and the wider civilization depended not only on the main Indus, but on a network of rivers and seasonal streams. As channels shifted across centuries, the map of opportunity changed with them. A settlement built in the right place can become inconvenient without moving an inch. This is one of the great ironies of river civilizations. Their success locks them into landscapes that are never fixed. The same alluvium that feeds fields also buries old surfaces. The same floods that renew fertility can erase neighborhoods. The same river that connects a city to trade can cut a new course and leave old roots weakened. Mohenjo-Daro's builders understood risk, but understanding is not control. They could raise platforms, repair drains, and choose building materials wisely. They could not command the monsoon freeze a river channel, or guarantee that the broader hydrological system would remain favorable forever. The early signs of stress also appear in the wider Indus world, though unevenly. The civilization does not decline everywhere at once in the same way. Some cities weaken while smaller settlements continue. Some regions see dispersal rather than disappearance. Urban life gives way in places to more localized patterns. This unevenness is important because it argues against a single simple catastrophe. If Mohenjo-Daro had been destroyed overnight by one dramatic event, the archaeological signature would likely be different. Instead, the evidence points toward a complicated transformation across regions, with environmental, economic, and social factors interacting over time. At Mohenjo-Daro, the experience of stress would have been local and personal. A household does not speak of regional transformation. It notices that a room must be repaired again. It notices that a well tastes different, that a wall leans, that trade goods are less available, that a workshop has fewer orders, that relatives move away, that a familiar neighborhood becomes more crowded or less carefully maintained. A farmer outside the city notices changes in flood timing, soil condition, or labor demands. A craftsperson notices whether carnelian shell copper or fuel arrives as reliably as before. A city begins to fail not only when buildings fall, but when confidence in the future of those buildings weakens. Scholars still debate how visible this weakening is in the archaeological record. Some older narratives imagined a sharp degeneration in the final levels of Mohenjo-Daro, but later work has often been more cautious. Excavation methods in the early 20th century were not always refined enough by modern standards, and the site is difficult to interpret because of erosion, groundwater salt damage, and the sheer complexity of its layers. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet the broader pattern remains after centuries of urban achievement. The major Indus cities lose their centrality. The systems that once sustained them no longer operate in the same way. The cracks then are not only physical, They're cracks in a relationship between river and city field, and household craft and exchange authority and maintenance. A drain can be cleared, a wall can be rebuilt, a flooded room can be dried. But when many such problems recur, and when the wider world also shifts, even a city of astonishing order can become fragile. Mohenjo-Daro's decline begins to feel less like a single wound, and more like a body struggling to heal from too many small injuries. The mystery deepens precisely because the city does not immediately die. It endures, adapts, absorbs damage, and continues to be inhabited. That endurance makes the final abandonment more haunting. The people of Mohenjo-Daro were not fleeing at the first sign of trouble. They were living through generations of adjustment. They were making choices inside uncertainty, as people always do. And somewhere in that long sequence of repair and persistence, the balance changed. The old city, once worth rebuilding again and again, slowly became a place from which departure made more sense than return. The idea that Mohenjo-Daro was abandoned overnight survives because it is emotionally powerful. It gives the ruins a single terrible moment. It lets the imagination enter the city on a final evening, when lamps still burn, grain still rests in jars, water still glints in wells, and people still believe tomorrow will resemble today. Then something happens. The city empties. The streets become silent. The houses are left to dust. The past closes like a door. It is a beautiful shape for a mystery, but beauty is not evidence. Archaeology makes the story more complicated. Mohenjo-Daro does not appear as a perfectly frozen city sealed suddenly beneath ash or volcanic debris like Pompeii. It does not preserve bodies in rooms, meals on tables, or a single destruction layer that announces one catastrophic end. Instead, it shows long occupation, rebuilding, disturbance, erosion, flood deposits, changing use of space, and gradual decline in the broader urban system. The evidence remains incomplete, but the strongest mainstream view is not that every household fled in one night. It is that the city's importance diminished over time as environmental and social pressures made the old urban pattern harder to sustain. The myth of sudden doom grew partly from early discoveries and partly from the human hunger for dramatic endings. When archaeologists first brought Mohenjo-Daro to global attention in the 20th century, the public encountered a city older than many expected, belonging to a civilization barely known before excavation. Its streets and drains seemed astonishing. Its script was unreadable. Its people had no familiar kings, and among the finds were human skeletons in positions that looked disturbing to early interpreters. The ingredients were perfect for a story of massacre, disaster, or abrupt abandonment. Once such a story enters the imagination, it is difficult to remove, but a city can be abandoned without a final day worthy of legend. It can hollow out, it can shrink, it can become less maintained. Some neighborhoods may empty before others, buildings may be reused, subdivided, or stripped for materials. Public systems may continue in partial form, then fail unevenly. Families may leave season by season not because they are terrified, but because opportunity has shifted elsewhere. Craftspeople follow trade. Farmers follow water. Administrators follow whatever institutions still matter. Children born in the city may grow old in smaller settlements beyond it. Later generations may remember the place differently or not at all. This slower version is less cinematic, but it may be more unsettling. Sudden catastrophe preserves innocence. Gradual abandonment suggests recognition. People have time to notice that something is wrong. They debate, delay, repair, hope, and adapt. They may not understand the full scale of change because no one lives with a bird's-eye view of history. But they know when the old rhythm weakens. They know when a well is unreliable, when a field yields less, when a flood damages too much, when a trading partner no longer comes when a public drain remains broken longer than it should. The end of a city is often made of practical decisions that feel temporary until they become permanent. There is no need to imagine panic in every lane. Some departures may have been orderly. Goods could be packed, animals could be moved, useful materials could be taken, houses might be closed, abandoned, occupied by poorer families, or converted to other uses. A city does not belong equally to all its inhabitants, so decline would not affect everyone in the same way. Some groups may leave early because they have options. Others remain because they cannot leave or because they still believe recovery is possible. The archaeological record rarely preserves this social texture clearly, but what survives suggests that abandonment is a process, not a single gesture. One surprising detail is that the so-called end of the Indus civilization is not an end to the people of the Indus world. Populations do not simply vanish. Many communities continue in transformed ways after the decline of the great urban centres. Settlement patterns shift eastward and towards smaller rural sites in some regions. Certain craft traditions persist, though often altered. Agricultural strategies change. The urban integration that once linked major cities weakens, but human life continues. This is why the phrase vanished. Civilization must be used carefully. The cities decline, the people adapt. The overnight version also depends on imagining Mohenjo-Daro as if it were a single organism with a single death. But ancient cities are layered communities. A wealthy household, a bead-making workshop, a group of labourers near the edge of the settlement, a family tied to river trade, a rural producer bringing grain into the city, and someone associated with public buildings on the raised mound, may all experience decline differently. The abandonment of the city may not have meant the same thing to each of them. For some it may have been loss, for others relief, for others merely movement in a world where movement had always been part of survival. This does not mean there were no moments of crisis. There may well have been damaging floods, disease outbreaks, food shortages, local violence, or sudden episodes that forced temporary evacuations. No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence, and it would be wrong to replace one simplistic story with another. A gradual decline can include abrupt shocks. A city can suffer a flood in one generation, a trade disruption in another, and a climate shift across several. What archaeology resists is the claim that one dramatic night explains everything. The difference between event and process is crucial. A fire destroys a house in an event. A neighbourhood declines through process. A river flood may be an event. A river system shifting over centuries is process. A drought year is an event. A weakening monsoon pattern is process. Mohenjo-Daro's abandonment likely belongs to the difficult space where many events occur inside larger processes. That makes the mystery harder but also richer. It asks us not merely what happened, but how long it took people to realize that the city's future had changed. The legend of sudden abandonment also says something about modern expectations. People often prefer collapse to have a visible villain, an invading army, a plague, an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, a mysterious weapon. These stories provide closure. They allow the ruins to be explained by impact rather than vulnerability. But Mohenjo-Daro may represent a more familiar and uncomfortable truth. Complex societies can be undone by accumulated strain. Infrastructure, environment, economy, and social confidence can weaken together until a place no longer holds the same promise it once did. What survives in the record suggests that the city's decline was not theatrical enough to satisfy legend, but it was profound enough to change history. The drains that once carried wastewater through planned streets stopped being maintained. Wells remained as shafts into a past no one renewed. Houses eroded. Floods, wine silt, and later human activity altered the exposed remains. The city that had once been a living centre became a mound, then a memory without a readable name, then a rediscovery. So the myth of overnight abandonment should not be thrown away entirely, it should be transformed. It is not literally true in the simple sense, yet it captures something real about how ruins affect the human mind. After enough time has passed, gradual processes become invisible, and only the before and after remain. There was a city. Then there was silence. Between those two facts lies the slow disaster archaeology, tries to reconstruct one layer, one brick, one broken object at a time. The bodies gave the city its darkest legend. When early excavators uncovered human skeletons at Mohenjo-Daro, some lying in streets, or unusual positions rather than formal graves, the discoveries seemed to offer the dramatic ending that the ruins themselves refused to provide. Here at last was an image that felt like evidence of a final catastrophe. People dead where they fell, a city struck by violence, a civilization ended not by slow adjustment, but by an attack so sudden that the victims could not even be buried. It was a powerful story, and for a time it shaped how many people imagined the last days of the Indus world. The older interpretation became linked to the idea of invasion. In the early and mid-20th century, some scholars connected the decline of the Indus cities with the arrival of Indo-Aryan-speaking groups imagining violent destruction by outsiders. The skeletons from Mohenjo-Daro seemed at first glance to fit that picture. A few showed injuries. Their scattered placement appeared disturbing. Later, popular accounts pushed the idea further, turning uncertain remains into scenes of massacre. But archaeology has moved far beyond that simple explanation. The evidence remains incomplete, and the bodies do not support the grand story once built around them. Part of the problem lies in context. The skeletons were not all found in one clear destruction layer. They were not discovered in a single moment of citywide death sealed beneath collapsed buildings or ash. Some came from different levels, different places, and uncertain depositional situations. Early excavation records, while valuable, do not always meet modern standards for stratigraphic precision. The site had already suffered erosion, disturbance, flooding, and centuries of decay. Human bones in a street may reflect many possibilities: improper burial during crisis, later intrusion, erosion of graves, disease, localized violence, neglect, or post-abandonment disturbance. The presence of bodies is real. The story attached to them is less secure. This is where the mystery becomes more sober and more interesting. Human remains do not simply illustrate a theory, they challenge it. Some individuals from Mohenjo-Daro show signs of trauma, but trauma exists in many societies and does not automatically prove invasion or massacre. Ancient cities contain accidents, interpersonal violence, social inequality, illness, and hardship. A blow to the head can be murder, warfare, punishment, accident, or something else entirely. Without clear context, bones speak in fragments. Scholars still debate the meaning of some injuries, but the idea that these skeletons represent the final slaughter of the city is not accepted as the best explanation. Disease is another possibility often raised, though difficult to prove. Dense urban life creates conditions where illness can spread, especially when water systems fail or flooding contaminates supplies. Mohenjo-Daro's drainage system was impressive, but no city is immune to disease. If late urban maintenance weakened sanitation could have become less effective, stagnant water crowding malnutrition and stress can combine in dangerous ways. Yet there is no decisive evidence for a single epidemic wiping out the city. Epidemic disease could have been one factor in hardship, but no single explanation fully accounts for abandonment. The placement of some bodies in public areas remains unsettling. Formal burial practices usually reflect care ritual and social obligation. Bodies left unburied or poorly buried can indicate disruption. But disruption can occur on many scales. A flood may expose or move remains. A local outbreak may overwhelm a household. A family may leave before burial is completed. A marginalized person may not receive formal treatment. A violent episode may occur in one neighborhood without explaining the fate of the entire city. The temptation is to make every skeleton into a witness of the last day, but the archaeological record rarely allows such certainty. One lesser-known complication is that the number of dramatic skeletons is small compared with the size and long life of the city. Mohenjo-Daro housed thousands of people over centuries. If it had ended in a massive massacre, one might expect a larger, clearer pattern of violent death destruction, burning weapons and bodies in secure association. Instead, the remains are scattered and ambiguous. That does not make them unimportant. It makes them more human. They may belong to people caught in local crisis rather than a civilization-ending event. The famous invasion theory also carried assumptions from its own time. Early archaeology was often influenced by colonial-era models of migration conquest and racial replacement. It sought dramatic external causes for cultural change. Later research has become more careful, recognizing that societies can transform through climate economy, internal reorganization, migration, and cultural blending without simple stories of one people destroying another. The decline of the Indus cities and the later emergence of Indo-Aryan languages and Vedic culture remain complex topics, but the old image of warriors abruptly annihilating Mohenjo-Daro is no longer convincing as a straightforward explanation. Still, the bodies should not be softened into nothing. They remind us that decline is lived through flesh. Whatever happened to Mohenjo-Daro was not merely a shift in settlement patterns or a line on a climate graph. It affected bodies, their nutrition, injuries, diseases, labor burdens, and deaths. Bioarchaeological studies of Indus remains have explored health, stress, cranial injuries, infection, and social differences, suggesting that life in and around these cities was not uniformly comfortable. The polished image of the orderly Indus city must be balanced with the reality that some people suffered inside that order. The skeletons also force a deeper question about visibility. Elite monuments are absent, texts are unreadable, and political history is hidden, but bones preserve direct evidence of human vulnerability. A broken skull does not reveal the name of an attacker. An infected bone does not name the disease with certainty. A body found outside formal burial does not explain the city's decline. Yet these remains break through the abstract scale of civilization. They say that behind every theory of collapse are individual lives ending in specific, unrecoverable circumstances. In popular retellings, the bodies in the streets become the answer. In responsible history, they become evidence that must be placed among other evidence. Flooding river change, climate stress, economic shifts, social reorganization, and local episodes of hardship all remain in play. The skeletons may show that parts of the city experienced violence or disorder. They do not prove that Mohenjo-Daro was destroyed overnight. They deepen the mystery by showing how easily a fragment of truth can be expanded into a myth. The city's dead therefore stand at the boundary between archaeology and imagination. Their bones were real, their suffering was real. But the story of their final moments is mostly beyond recovery. Some may have died long before the city's final abandonment. Some may have belonged to late stressed phases of occupation. Some may have been disturbed after burial. Some may have died in ways that had little to do with the wider decline. What survives in the record suggests not one clean massacre, but scattered traces of human trouble inside a city already vulnerable to larger pressures. And that is perhaps more haunting than the old invasion tale. A massacre gives the ruins an enemy. Ambiguity gives them time. It leaves us with people who died in a city that was changing in streets that had once been maintained with care near drains and walls and wells that belonged to a civilization of extraordinary order. Their bodies do not solve the abandonment. They warn against easy solutions. They show that the end of Mohenjo-Daro was not only environmental, not only economic, not only political, and not only mythical. It was human, uneven, and partially lost. The climate does not have to announce its betrayal. It can change by degrees, by seasons that arrive slightly weaker, by rains that come late, by flood pulses that no longer behave as memory says they should. A single dry year can be endured. 2 dry years can be explained away. A generation of altered rainfall becomes harder to name from inside the experience because people do not live in graphs. They live in fields, wells, riverbanks, storage rooms, and household decisions. For Mohenjo-Daro, a city whose life depends on water in both practical and symbolic ways, the shifting climate of the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE may be one of the deepest forces behind its decline. The Indus civilization flourished during a period when monsoon systems and river landscapes supported dense settlement across large parts of northwest South Asia. The summer monsoon was never a simple guarantee, and the Indus itself draws heavily from snowmelt and mountain-fed waters, as well as seasonal rains, but rainfall patterns shaped agriculture, pasture flood behavior, and regional settlement. When the monsoon weakens over long periods, the effects are not uniform. Some places become less reliable. Some river channels lose seasonal strength. Some fields become riskier. Some communities adapt by changing crops, moving settlements, relying more on local systems, or shifting toward regions where water remains more predictable. This is where the abandoned city becomes part of a larger environmental story. Climate records from lake sediments, marine cores, speleothems, and other paleoclimate archives suggest that parts of the broader region experienced aridification and weakening monsoon conditions around the time the mature Indus urban system began to transform. The exact timing, local impact, and relationship to individual cities remain debated, but the pattern is too important to ignore. What survives in the record suggests that climate stress did not simply destroy Mohenjo-Daro like a hammer striking glass. Instead, it altered the conditions that had made large urban life sustainable. A water-built civilization is vulnerable in more than one direction. Too little water damages crops, pastures, and wells. Too much water in the wrong place damages houses, drain storage, and streets. Unpredictable water may be worse than either abundance or scarcity alone. Farmers depend not only on rain, but on timing. Floodplain agriculture depends on rhythms. Urban storage depends on surplus. Craft specialists depend on farmers producing more than their own households need. Traders depend on goods worth moving. Administrators, whatever form they took, depend on the ability to coordinate resources. When water becomes unreliable, the entire chain tightens. Mohenjo-Daro's own position near the Indus may have protected it from some kinds of drought while exposing it to other hazards. A river-fed city is not instantly abandoned when monsoon rains weaken. The Indus can still flow, and floodplain farming can still function. This is why climate alone cannot be treated as a simple switch. Scholars still debate how directly weakening monsoons affected Mohenjo-Daro itself, compared with settlements in regions dependent on smaller rivers or seasonal streams. But even if the main river continued to provide water, the wider network that supported the city may have frayed. Rural producers, trade routes, grazing zones, and neighbouring settlements could all feel stressed differently. A city can suffer because its hinterland suffers. One especially important part of the wider story involves river systems to the east, including channels associated with the Gaga-Hakra region. Many Indus settlements were located along now dry or seasonal river courses, and scholars continue to debate the ancient flow history of these systems. Some older theories imagined a single mighty river disappearing suddenly and bringing civilization down with it. Current evidence is more complex. River changes occurred over long timescales, and some major shifts may have predated the urban peak. Still weakening monsoon-fed flows and changing river conditions likely affected settlement choices. People moved toward more reliable water, or toward places where smaller-scale farming made better sense than large urban concentration. The surprising thing is that climate stress may not have made people helpless. It may have made them less urban. That distinction is crucial. The decline of great cities does not mean the collapse of all life. In some regions, communities appear to shift towards smaller settlements, more diversified subsistence, and local adaptations. The mature Indus system, with its standardized weights, seals cities, and long-distance integration begins to loosen. But human beings continue to farm, herd, make pottery, exchange goods, and preserve elements of older traditions. The crisis may have been less a universal death sentence than a forced reorganization of scale. At Mohenjo-Daro, the consequences of climate change would be filtered through infrastructure. Wells might still reach water, but groundwater levels and quality could fluctuate. Floods might become less predictable, depositing silt in some years and failing to replenish fields in others. Heat and evaporation could worsen salinity. Food supply might become more expensive or irregular. Fuel for brick firing and craft industries might become harder to gather if surrounding environments were stressed. A city famous for fired brick also depends on enormous quantities of fuel, and although the exact ecological impact remains debated, large-scale brick production is never environmentally invisible. The link between climate and social order is indirect but powerful. A weakened monsoon does not walk into a city and close its gates. It changes the calculations of farmers, herders, traders, builders, and families. If surplus declines, fewer people can live as full-time craft specialists. If rural communities become more self-sufficient, long-distance exchange may matter less. If maintaining drains, wells, platforms, and public buildings requires labour that no longer brings enough, return maintenance suffers. If political or administrative authority depends on coordinating surplus, then environmental stress can quietly undermine authority without a battle. This helps explain why the city's decline may have been gradual. Climate pressure often works as a multiplier. It magnifies existing weaknesses. A flood-damaged neighbourhood is harder to restore when food stores are low. A trade disruption is more serious when crops are unreliable. Social tension rises when households compete over shrinking resources. Disease spreads more easily when nutrition weakens or water quality worsens. No single explanation fully accounts for Mohenjo-Daro's abandonment because the most plausible explanations overlap. Climate may not be the whole story, but it may be the slow background force that makes every other problem sharper. The ancient residents would not have described the process in modern climatological terms. They may have spoken of bad seasons, failed floods, restless rivers, poor harvests, sickness, bad luck, divine displeasure, broken obligations, or simply the need to leave. Their decisions would have been practical before they were historical. Move a household, send relatives elsewhere, shift a workshop, store differently, plant differently, trade differently, stay one more year, leave after the next flood, return if conditions improve, then across generations the return never comes. The city's silence today can make climate change seem abstract, but it was never abstract there. It was mud in a lane, salt on soil, a lower yield, a damaged wall, a dry channel, a contaminated well, a delayed shipment, a family leaving. The great systems of Mohenjo-Daro were built to manage water, yet they were still bound to a world larger than the city. When that world changed, the brilliance of the city could not fully protect it. Its drains, wells, and platforms were evidence of adaptation, but also reminders that adaptation has limits. The climate did not need to destroy Mohenjo-Daro in one night. It only needed to make the old bargain less favourable slowly enough that people could keep hoping, and deeply enough that their descendants chose differently. The city born from water now stood in a landscape where water was changing its terms, and as those terms shifted the networks beyond the city, the roots fields and distant exchanges that had once fed its confidence began to grow quiet too. When trade grows quiet, a city may not hear it at first. There is no single moment when the world announces that a route has weakened, that a distant partner has turned elsewhere, that a craft once valued across seas will no longer move with the same certainty. The change arrives through absences: fewer boats, fewer pack animals, fewer shells from the coast, fewer rare stones from distant hills, fewer seals pressed into clay for goods that once travelled as part of a larger confidence. For Mohenjo-Daro, the weakening of exchange may have been another pressure added to the river, the climate, the fields, and the slow strain of maintaining a great city. The Indus world was deeply connected, though not in the noisy imperial way of armies and conquest records. Its connections appear in objects: carnelian beads, etched beads, shell ornaments, copper, bronze, standardized weights, seals, pottery, timber, stone, and perhaps textiles moved across landscapes and beyond them. Indus goods reached Mesopotamia, where texts refer to a place called Meluha, widely associated by scholars with the Indus region or its trading sphere. There were Meluhan traders, Meluhan ships, and interpreters for Meluhan speech in Mesopotamian records. The details remain debated, but the broad picture is clear enough. Mohenjo-Daro belonged to a civilization with long-distance economic reach. Trade was not merely luxury. It supported identity, craft specialization, and urban integration. A bead workshop depends on raw stone and demand. A seal maker depends on a world where marking goods matters. A merchant depends on trust measures, routes, and buyers. A city depends on rural surplus, but it also depends on reasons for people to gather densely in one place. When exchange networks are strong, they pull materials and people toward urban centers. When they weaken, the advantages of city life may shrink. The Mesopotamian connection is especially revealing because it changes over time. During the height of Indus urbanism, goods and references suggest contact across the Arabian Sea and through Gulf intermediaries. Later, those links appear to decline or transform. Mesopotamia itself was not stable forever. It faced its own political shifts, environmental stresses, and changing trade priorities. When distant partners weaken, reorganize, or stop demanding certain goods, the effects can ripple outward. Mohenjo-Daro does not need to be conquered by foreigners to suffer from foreign change. It only needs the larger economic web to lose tension. One lesser-known detail is that Indus trade may have relied not only on direct exchange with Mesopotamia, but also on intermediary regions such as Dilmun, often associated with Bahrain and the Gulf, and Margan associated with Oman and nearby areas. Goods could pass through multiple hands before reaching their final destination. This makes the network flexible, but also vulnerable. If one link changes, the flow alters. If coastal routes become less profitable, if political demand shifts, if ships travel elsewhere, or if internal production weakens, inland cities feel it indirectly. A craftsperson in Mohenjo-Daro may never see Mesopotamia yet still depend on patterns that reach that far. Trade routes also depend on ecological stability. Rivers move goods, floodplains feed caravans, ports require navigable channels and functioning hinterlands. If climate stress affects agricultural surplus, fewer goods may be available for exchange. If river courses shift, transportation becomes harder. If communities disperse into smaller settlements, centralized production and distribution may weaken. Economic decline and environmental change therefore cannot be neatly separated. They feed into each other, each making the other more damaging. The standardized weights of the Indus civilization are a quiet witness to the importance of exchange. Their precision suggests a world where quantities has to be trusted across distance. To weigh is to agree on value, or at least on measure. To standardize weights across regions is to create an invisible bridge between people who may never meet. When such systems begin to fade, it may signal not only economic change but a weakening of shared authority. The loss of standardization is not simply technical. It means the world is becoming more local. That localization appears in the later phases of the Indus tradition. The great cities decline and regional cultures become more distinct. Pottery styles diversify. Settlement patterns shift. Some markers of the mature urban system disappear or become less common. This does not mean trade ends entirely. People continue to exchange goods sometimes over significant distances. But the vast integrated pattern that made Mohenjo-Daro one node in a larger civilizational network seems to loosen. What survives in the record suggests not a blackout but a dimming. Inside the city, such dimming would touch many lives. A bead maker may still make beads, but perhaps fewer of the most elaborate kind. A household may still wear ornaments, but materials once common become rare. A trader may still travel, but routes are shorter, returns less certain. A seal may still carry meaning, but the administrative world around it may shrink. Workshops may close, merge, or adapt to local demand. A city built partly on specialization becomes vulnerable when specialists can no longer rely on the web that once sustained them. There is also a social consequence to economic weakening. Urban life is dense because it offers advantages: access to goods, labor marriage networks, ritual spaces, protection, administration, markets, information and opportunity. If those advantages decline, the costs of city life become more visible. Crowding maintenance vulnerability to flood dependence on incoming food and exposure to disease become harder to justify. Smaller settlements may begin to look safer, more flexible, and closer to resources. Families do not need to reject the city dramatically. They can simply choose not to return. Scholars still debate how much trade decline contributed to Mohenjo-Daro's abandonment. It would be too simple to say that Mesopotamian demand fell and the city died. The Indus civilization was not merely an export economy. Its roots were regional and agricultural as much as commercial. But long-distance exchange helped bind the urban system together, and its weakening likely removed one layer of support at a time when environmental pressures were already rising. No single explanation fully accounts for the city's fate, but trade routes going quiet help explain why recovery may have become harder. A city's greatness often depends on being necessary. Mohenjo-Daro had once been necessary to a wide world of production, movement, measurement, and social order. It concentrated skills, regulated flows, and embodied shared standards. But if the river became troublesome, the climate less reliable, the hinterland more strained, and trade less rewarding, necessity could drift elsewhere. The city might remain impressive, but impressiveness does not feed people. Brick memory does not guarantee future use. This is one of the hardest truths of ancient abandonment. Cities are not abandoned because people forget how beautiful or important they are. They are abandoned because the living advantages fade. The old streets may still be known, the wells may still exist, the houses may still stand. But if the network no longer pulls people inward, the city becomes heavy. It demands repair without offering enough in return. It asks for labor loyalty and belief. Slowly, fewer people answer. Mohenjo-Daro's silence therefore widens beyond its walls. The empty city is also the sound of distant harbours changing, of traders choosing other paths, of rural communities adjusting to local survival of measures, losing their old reach of seals, becoming relics of a system no longer whole. The city was never alone, and so it did not decline alone. Its abandonment belongs to a wider unravelling where water, climate, trade and social organisation all shifted until the great urban centre no longer held the future as firmly as it once had. The people of Mohenjo-Daro did not vanish with the city. This may be the most important correction to the old mystery, because ruins encourage a false kind of disappearance. A wall falls, a street empties, a seal lies buried, and the mind imagines an entire population erased. But cities are not people. Cities are arrangements people use for as long as those arrangements work. When the arrangement fails, people carry on elsewhere, altered by what they have lost but not dissolved into nothing. As the great urban centres of the Indus world decline, life spreads into smaller forms. Settlement patterns shift. Some communities move eastward, some toward more local river systems, some into rural landscapes, where large-scale urban coordination matters less than flexible survival. Farming continues, herding continues, pottery continues, craft traditions continue, though often in changed form. The mature Indus system with its wide standardization and great cities weakens, but the human fabric does not simply tear apart everywhere at once. What survives in the record suggests transformation rather than extinction. For families leaving Mohenjo-Daro, departure may have been practical before it was tragic. A household might follow kin to a smaller settlement where fields are more reliable. A craftsperson might relocate closer to raw materials or local markets. Farmers connected to the city might stop sending surplus inward and keep production nearer home. Traders might shorten their routes. A young person might grow up hearing that the old city was once greater, busier, cleaner, better ordered, but choose a life where food, water, and safety feel more certain. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the broad pattern suggests adaptation on a human scale. This afterlife of the Indus world is easy to underestimate because it lacks the grandeur of Mohenjo-Daro's streets. Archaeology often notices cities more readily than villages because cities leave thicker deposits, bigger walls, and more dramatic ruins. But after urban decline, the centre of life may shift to places that do not impress the eye in the same way. Smaller settlements can be resilient precisely because they are less dependent on vast systems. They require less imported food, less centralised maintenance, less specialised labour, and less elaborate infrastructure. In a changing climate and economic landscape, that simplicity can be strength. Some elements of Indus culture fade while others persist in altered forms. The script disappears from common use. The standardized seals and weights lose their old civilizational reach. Urban drainage on the scale of Mohenjo-Daro is no longer the defining feature of settlement. Yet pottery habits, agricultural knowledge, craft skills, ornament, symbolic traditions, and ways of living with river landscapes continue in various regional forms. Scholars still debate which later South Asian cultural practices, if any, can be traced directly back to the Indus world, and caution is necessary. Continuity is rarely a straight line. It is more often a braid with strands preserved, broken, reworked, and joined by new influences. The end of Mohenjo-Daro therefore becomes less like a tomb and more like a dispersal. Imagine not one final column of refugees fleeing a burning city, but many quieter movements over time. A courtyard emptied, a workshop closed, a family well no longer cleaned, a lane used less frequently, a house stripped of useful timber baskets, tools, and portable goods, a wall left unrepaired after the rains. People leave behind what is too heavy, too broken, too ordinary, or too tied to a place whose promise has faded. They take what matters for the next life elsewhere. There is a deep human realism in this. Most endings in history are not clean. They are negotiated. Someone stays after others leave. Someone returns briefly to collect something. Someone uses an abandoned room for storage. Someone rebuilds badly because there is no better choice. Someone is born in a city already past its height and never sees the grandeur scholars later reconstruct. For that person, decline is not decline. It is just the world as given. The consequences reach far beyond Mohenjo-Daro. The weakening of the urban Indus system changes the map of ancient South Asia. Large city-based integration gives way to more regional patterns. New cultural formations emerge over time. Languages, populations, technologies, and beliefs continue to shift through migration exchange, local development, and contact. No single explanation fully accounts for this long transformation, and it should not be reduced to a single invasion, drought, flood, or migration. The world after Mohenjo-Daro is not empty. It is crowded with change. The tragedy, if there is one, lies partly in the loss of memory. Because the script is unread, and because later traditions do not clearly preserve the city's own name, Mohenjo-Daro slips out of remembered history. Its descendants, biological or cultural, may have lived on in many places, but the city itself loses its story. The people who left may have remembered it for a time. Their children may have heard fragments. Their grandchildren may have known only old mounds, old bricks, old warnings about floods or spirits or the dead. Eventually the city became landscape. This is how civilizations disappear without their people disappearing. Institutions fail. Writing systems vanish. Trade networks dissolve. Urban habits stop being reproduced. Names are forgotten. The physical place remains, but the chain of explanation breaks. By the time modern archaeologists arrive, Mohenjo-Daro is not a city in memory. It is a mound in the earth. And yet something survives beneath that forgetting. It survives in the brick ratios, the drilled beads, the wells, the drains, the small toys, the ornaments, and the altered settlement patterns beyond the urban peak. It survives in the fact that people adapted instead of simply ending. The abandoned city is not proof that they failed at being human. It is proof that one form of life became too difficult to sustain, and another had to be made. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro emptied, but the human story moved outward. It crossed fields, followed water, entered villages, changed its tools, changed its habits, and continued beyond the reach of the city's name. That is why the ruin feels so powerful. It preserves both disappearance and survival at once. The city died as a center, but the people who had made it possible stepped into a different future, leaving behind an urban memory so complete in brick and so incomplete in words that it still feels like a question waiting in the dust. Because Mohenjo-Daro refuses a simple ending, every explanation has to stand beside the others rather than replace them. The old stories wanted one cause: an invasion, a massacre, a flood, a plague, a drought, a river gone mad, a city abandoned in fear before a disaster so sudden that ordinary life stopped in place. But the deeper one follows the evidence the more the city seems to resist that kind of closure. It does not offer the clean signature of a single destruction event. It offers a set of pressures, each plausible, in part each incomplete alone, all gathering around a civilization whose old systems became harder to sustain. The invasion theory has the greatest dramatic force and the weakest modern hold. It once seemed to explain the scattered skeletons, the decline of cities, and later cultural changes in South Asia all at once. But the more carefully those pieces are examined, the less neatly they fit. The bodies at Mohenjo-Daro do not form a clear massacre layer. The city does not show the kind of widespread destruction one would expect from a conquering army. Later migrations and cultural shifts were real and complex, but they cannot simply be turned into a single violent night at the city's end. Scholars still debate the broader movements of peoples and languages in ancient South Asia, but the specific image of Mohenjo-Daro destroyed by invaders is no longer a satisfying answer. Flooding is far more grounded in the site itself. The city lived in relationship with a powerful river system, and flood deposits, rebuilding raised levels, and water damage all belong to its history. Floods could have damaged neighborhoods, ruined stores, contaminated wells, and forced temporary abandonment. Repeated flooding could have made maintenance exhausting. Yet flood alone also struggles as a complete explanation. The people of Mohenjo-Daro knew how to rebuild after floods, and they did so many times. A single flood might wound a city, many floods might weaken it. But to explain the broader decline of the Indus urban system, flooding must be placed alongside climate economy and settlement change. Drought and monsoon weakening provide a wider frame. Paleoclimate evidence suggests aridification and changes in rainfall patterns around the period when the mature Indus civilization transforms. This does not mean every city dried up at once, or that people stood helpless beneath an empty sky. The Indus River continued to flow, and different regions experienced water stress differently. But weakening monsoons could reduce agricultural reliability, alter smaller river systems, shift settlement patterns, and make large urban centres less practical. Climate is not a villain with a sword. It is a pressure that changes the value of every other decision. River migration adds another layer. Rivers in alluvial plains do not stay politely where cities prefer them. Channels shift, silt builds, flows weaken or intensify, and landscapes that once made sense can become awkward or dangerous. A city may find itself too exposed to flooding, too removed from useful transport, or dependent on rural zones whose water conditions have changed. In the wider Indus world, river changes likely helped reshape where people lived and how they farmed. No single explanation fully accounts for this because rivers are not events. They're moving systems, and cities must either move with them or adapt until adaptation fails. Epidemic disease remains possible but difficult to prove. Dense urban settlements always carry disease risks, especially where water-waste animals and people coexist closely. Mohenjo-Daro's drainage system may have reduced some risks, but if maintenance declined or floods contaminated water supplies, illness could have spread. Skeletal evidence can reveal some health stresses, but it cannot yet identify a city-ending epidemic. Disease may have contributed to hardship without leaving the decisive signature needed to make it the central cause. Economic weakening also fits the pattern, especially when seen through the fading of long-distance integration. The Indus world was tied together by seals, waitscraft production, and trade routes reaching far beyond one city. If demand shifted routes, weakened coastal exchange, changed, or regional communities became more localized, Mohenjo-Daro would lose part of what made it useful. A large city needs reasons to remain large. Once trade administration and craft specialization shrink, the costs of urban life become harder to justify. Then there is social change, the least visible and perhaps the most important. Authority in Mohenjo-Daro may not have centered on kings' palaces or armies. It may have lived in shared standards, civic habits, ritual practices, merchants, local leaders, or institutions whose names are lost. Such a system can endure for centuries, but it can also fragment quietly. If neighborhoods begin acting more independently, if standards lose force, if maintenance becomes uneven, if confidence in the city's future weakens, then the urban order can dissolve without conquest. The city's power may have been quiet, and so its failure may have been quiet too. Popular and fringe theories enter this gap because uncertainty attracts spectacle. Claims of ancient explosions, lost advanced technologies, or impossible catastrophes sometimes attach themselves to Mohenjo-Daro, especially through distorted readings of the skeletons or the city's baked brick. These ideas are disputed and unsupported by mainstream archaeology. They survive because they make the city's silence feel intentional, as though a secret too large for ordinary history must be hidden there. But the real mystery does not need impossible machinery. It is already profound that a Bronze Age civilization of such scale could decline through forces that are recognizable, ordinary, and devastating in combination. The most responsible explanation is therefore not a single cause, but a convergence. Floods damage and force rebuilding. Climate shifts make agriculture less reliable. River changes alter the geography of survival. Trade weakens and urban specialization loses force. Social systems strain under repeated pressure. Some violence, disease, and local crisis may occur within that wider instability. People adapt by moving, dispersing, changing livelihoods, and building smaller worlds. The city is not murdered in one night. It is gradually made unnecessary, then unsustainable, then forgotten. This kind of explanation can feel unsatisfying because it refuses drama, yet it may be closer to how many civilizations actually change. Collapse is rarely pure collapse from the inside. It is transformation seen from the ruins. To the people leaving Mohenjo-Daro, the end may not have looked like the end of an age. It may have looked like a series of choices made under pressure: repair, or leave plant here or elsewhere, trade far or stay local, rebuild the wall or salvage the bricks, keep the old seal or set it aside. Mohenjo-Daro remains mysterious not because there are no explanations, but because there are too many partial ones and no final voice to arrange them. The unread script gives no verdict. The bodies do not settle the case. The river has moved. The climate record speaks in patterns, not memories. The bricks show order, then strain, then silence. What survives in the record suggests a civilization changing under accumulated pressure, and a city that endured until endurance no longer made sense. For thousands of years after Mohenjo-Daro lost its place in the living world, the city waited beneath its own ruin. Wind moved over the mounds, heat cracked the surface, floods and seasonal waters altered the edges. Ancient bricks once fitted into drains, wells, houses and platforms became part of the landscape, useful to later people as building material, or simply strange remnants from a time without a remembered name. The city did not disappear by sinking into the earth all at once. It became a mound slowly as walls collapsed, silt gathered, and memory thinned until the place was no longer understood as a city at all. When modern archaeology finally turned toward the site, the discovery was not merely of one ruin, but of an entire forgotten civilization. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, ancient bricks from Indus sites had already attracted attention, and some were even reused in railway construction. That detail is almost painfully ironic. Bricks shaped by one of the world's earliest urban cultures were pulled from dead cities to serve the machinery of a modern empire before the full importance of those cities was understood. The past was being dismantled at the same moment it was about to be recognized. Mohenjo-Daro came to prominence in the 1920s when excavations revealed the scale and sophistication of the site. Alongside Harappa, it forced a dramatic revision of ancient history. South Asia was no longer seen in archaeological terms as lacking an urban Bronze Age comparable in importance to Egypt and Mesopotamia. Here was a civilization with planned cities, standardized weights, seals, long-distance tradecraft specialization, and monumental public works of a quieter kind. yet it arrived without the readable texts that usually help anchor ancient worlds in names and events. From the beginning, discovery and uncertainty were bound together. Early excavators uncovered streets, drains, wells, bathing areas, brick platforms, seals, figurines, pottery beads, tools, and human remains. They also gave the site many of the labels still repeated today. Some labels were useful, others were speculative. The Great Bath remains a reasonable descriptive name for the famous tank, though its exact function is debated. The citadel suggests an elevated area, but can imply military meanings that may not fit. The priest-king became an icon, though its identity remains unknown. The granary may not have been a granary in the way first imagined. The evidence remains incomplete, and the history of excavation reminds us that archaeology is not only about finding objects, but about interpreting them through the assumptions of each era. Those assumptions mattered. Early 20th century archaeology often looked for kings, priests' invasions, and racial movements. It was influenced by colonial frameworks, biblical comparisons, and the models provided by Egypt and Mesopotamia. When Mohenjo-Daro did not fit neatly, interpreters sometimes forced it toward familiar shapes. Large buildings became administrative or religious centers. A dignified sculpture became a ruler. Scattered skeletons became massacre victims. The city's silence invited certainty from those who wanted the past to behave more simply than it does. Later research has been more cautious. Scholars have re-examined old excavation records, studied craft production settlement patterns, climate data, skeletal remains, river histories, and regional transformations. The picture has grown less dramatic in some ways, but more powerful in others. Mohenjo-Daro is no longer merely a lost city with a mysterious final day. It is a case study in urbanism, environmental adaptation, social organization, and the difficulty of reading a civilization that left material abundance but textual silence. No single explanation fully accounts for it, and that has become part of its importance. The city also faces a modern crisis of survival. The same baked bricks that endured for millennia are vulnerable once exposed. Salt rises through them. Moisture crystallizes. Heat, wind, groundwater tourism, and earlier excavation damage all threaten the ruins. Mohenjo-Daro is not a fixed treasure safely recovered from the past. It is still deteriorating. Conservation is difficult because the site is vast, fragile, and environmentally stressed. The ancient city that once fought water, salt, and mud in life continues to fight them in death. There is something fitting, though sobering, in that. Mohenjo-Daro's modern preservation problems echo its ancient vulnerabilities. Water remains both necessary and destructive. Salt still enters the brick. Human activity still reshapes the site. The city is not only an object of study, it is a material body under pressure. What survives in the record survives unevenly, and what future generations know will depend partly on what can be protected now. Rediscovery did not solve Mohenjo-Daro. It made the mystery larger. Before excavation, the city was hidden. After excavation, it became visible but not fully readable. Its streets could be mapped, but its name was still lost. Its drains could be admired, but its political system remained uncertain. Its seals could be catalogued but not deciphered. Its decline could be studied but not reduced to a single cause. Modern archaeology brought the city back into history, yet history still had gaps wide enough for silence to remain. And perhaps that is why Mohenjo-Daro continues to hold attention. It is not only ancient, it is unfinished. Every brick seems to promise order. Every unread sign withholds explanation. The modern rediscovery lifted the city from dust, but it also revealed how much dust still lies over human memory. The Mound of the Dead became once again a city of questions, What the empty city remembers is not a single catastrophe, but a long conversation between human confidence and the limits of the world. Mohenjo-daro was built as if order could endure. Its streets were drawn with intention, its wells were sunk with care, its drains were covered so that waste and water could pass beneath daily life without overwhelming it. Its bricks were shaped to shared standards and set into walls by hands that probably never imagined those same walls would one day be studied as clues to their own disappearance. The city's builders did not leave behind an explanation, but they left behind something almost as powerful evidence that they believed in repetition maintenance in the future. That belief is the foundation of every city. A city is always an act of trust. People agree openly or silently that this place will still matter tomorrow. Farmers bring food because buyers will be there. Craftspeople invest years in skill because materials and markets will continue to exist. Families build houses because children may inherit them. Workers dig drains because drains will need to function next season. Authorities, whether kings, councils, merchants, priests or customs, maintain standards because the shared order still has value. Mohenjo-daro's great achievement was not simply that it built well. It sustained a way of life that made such building meaningful. Its abandonment shows what happens when that trust thins, not necessarily in panic, not necessarily in defeat, perhaps not even with full awareness. The city's decline may have come through ordinary decisions under extraordinary pressure. A workshop closes, a family moves closer to reliable water, a trade connection weakens, a public structure loses importance, a drain is repaired one time fewer than before, a house is reused in a poorer form, a seal no longer carries the authority it once did. The old systems remain visible for a while like channels after water has drained away but their force is gone. This is why Mohenjo-daro matters beyond its own age. It reminds us that collapse is often not the opposite of sophistication. Sometimes sophistication creates new dependencies. The more organized a city becomes, the more it relies on systems that must continue together. Water, food, labor, trust, exchange, authority, health memory. Mohenjo-daro's drainage planning and standardization were strengths, but they also reveal how much had to keep working. When climate shifted, rivers changed, trade, weakened floods, damaged, and social arrangements adapted unevenly. The city's strengths may have become burdens. What once made urban life efficient may have made it expensive to maintain. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is not a failure of imagination. It is the condition of studying deep history. Archaeology deals in survivals, and survivals are biased toward what can endure brick, stone, bone-fired clay, shell metal, burned grain, impressed seals. It misses voices, songs, smells, gestures, arguments, hopes, fears, political compromises, and the moment a family decides that leaving is wiser than staying. Mohenjo-daro's unread script sharpens that loss. The city had signs, perhaps names, offices, commodities, identities, and rituals recorded in marks that still exist, but the meanings have slipped away. And yet the city is not unknowable. Its silence is not emptiness. It tells us that ancient South Asia produced one of the great urban traditions of the Bronze Age. It tells us that large societies can be highly coordinated without leaving obvious royal monuments. It tells us that water management, sanitation, craft precision, and standardization can be as historically significant as conquest. It tells us that people can survive the end of cities by becoming something else. It tells us that the phrase vanished. Civilization often hides a more complicated truth. Institutions vanish, cities vanish, writing systems vanish, but people continue carrying fragments forward in forms that are hard to trace. Mohenjo-daro also teaches caution. The desire for a dramatic answer is strong, A city abandoned overnight is easier to remember than a city slowly made unsustainable by many connected changes. A massacre is simpler than scattered deaths in uncertain context. An invasion is simpler than climate stress, river migration, trade decline, and social transformation acting together. A lost secret is simpler than patient excavation. But the past does not owe the present simplicity. No single explanation fully accounts for the end of Mohenjo-Daro, and forcing one answer may make the story smaller than the evidence deserves, so the empty streets remain. The Great Bath holds no water from the hands that once filled it. The wells descend into earth without the sound of ropes and jars. The drains still reveal a civilization attentive to the most practical details of urban life. The seals still carry animals and signs from a mind world we can see but not enter. The city is abandoned but not mute. It speaks through arrangement, through absence, through the stubborn survival of brick. What it remembers is the fragility of arrangements that feel permanent while people live inside them. It remembers that rivers move, rains change, trade routes fade, systems require care. Cities are not guaranteed by their brilliance. They endure only as long as the world around them and the people within them keep renewing the bargain. Mohenjo-Daro's people once renewed that bargain for centuries. Then slowly something changed. The bargain failed and the city became a mound beneath the sun, waiting for strangers to return and ask why. The answer, if there is one, is not a single event hidden somewhere in the dust. It is the dust itself, layer upon layer, each one a season, a repair, a flood, a departure, a forgetting. Mohenjo-Daro was not abandoned because it lacked intelligence or skill. It was abandoned because even intelligent, skilled societies live inside conditions they cannot fully control. The city's final lesson is not that civilizations vanish like smoke. It is that they transform, fragment, and leave behind traces that are at once precise and incomplete. A brick can survive, a name can disappear, a street can remain, a reason can be lost.